But the fact remains that the Southeast Asia is in turmoil, and this turmoil will increase as time goes by.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 211. He's back for the third time. It's Jayant Bhandari. He's a mining consultant. He also is a very well-traveled person. He's been to over 100 countries. He has a lot of opinions about the third world. And we're going to talk about some of the recent happenings in Myanmar or Burma, Bangladesh, and maybe some other countries too. But those are the things right now because that's where he's from. He's from India originally. So you can talk about some of India's neighbors. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So what has been going on in Bangladesh?
Well, let's take a larger picture of what is happening in the third world, Chris.
Okay.
And the larger picture is that Pax Americana has come to an end. America is no longer able to influence what happens in the third world countries. Now, close to 2/3 of the world's population lives in the third world. People think, the intellectuals, the United Nations, the World Bank kind of people think that the reason third world is relatively stable is because of its democracy. That is completely incorrect. The third world is relatively stable because of Pax Americana. When the third world country tyrant is fearful of American whip, he starts behaving very quickly. This has been the case in sub-Saharan Africa. This has been the case in Latin America. And this has been the case in the Indian subcontinent. They have behaved well, reasonably well, or whatever to the limit they have behaved well. It is because of the United States. Now the United States is becoming weaker and is made fun of around the world. And the end result is that the third world countries across the board are falling apart. That is what you see in Myanmar. That is what you see in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Now, I know that the general perception of India is that India is the fastest growing economy, a great country. It's going to be the next China. And that's all a myth. That's a myth propagated by the Western media. But India is falling apart as well. And then you have Pakistan, which has gone out of existence on your television screen for now. Sub-Saharan Africa is the same. There are coups happening. There have been 6 coups in Sub-Saharan Africa this year. No one knows about it. No one cares about it. I don't care about it either, unless I'm visiting those countries. There was a coup attempt in Bolivia. So look at this larger picture to understand what is happening in the third world country and the fact that there's now no one to dampen this falling apart, this instability that is becoming a day-to-day situation of the third world. In that comes Myanmar and Bangladesh. Myanmar has been in civil conflict for forever. Since the time they got the so-called independence, Myanmar has been in civil conflict, as has been the case basically with absolutely every single third world country where 2/3 of the world population lives. After the colonizers left, all these third world countries became tyrannies and their institutions stopped working the way they were supposed to work. So in comes in Myanmar recently, which has been under the control of the army. And I have spent a fair bit of my time traveling in Myanmar, including the areas which are controlled by the insurgents. Myanmar, as it stands today, is not one country anymore. It has fallen into separate jurisdictions where tribal units now control separate parts of Myanmar. And this is the situation with the northeastern part of India, Myanmar and Bangladesh. There are far too many tribal conflicts. Bangladesh was among the best countries, ironically, in South Asia. Its GDP per capita, and at least until about a month back, was higher than that of India, higher than that of Pakistan. and a multiple of that of Burmese. And Bangladesh was actually giving refuge to people from Myanmar. And suddenly the dictator could no longer hold on to power. Now, the dictator of Bangladesh, Hasina, was basically thrown out of power. And in no way am I going to claim that she was a saint, because she did a lot of dictatorial things, a lot of human rights violations, if I may say so. And she was too close to the Indian regime. So, things had to change. There were pressure, the pressure were building up within the society. But as long as Bangladesh was under dictatorial control, it was on the right path. Now it is in a transitionary government's hands, and then democracy will kick in, and Bangladesh's best days are in the past. Bangladesh will disintegrate, will go into horrible times in the future. And we can, of course, talk about why dictatorship is better than democracy, but that's maybe another question. But the fact remains that the Southeast Asia is in turmoil, and this turmoil will increase as time goes by.
Bangladesh has 148 million people about. Is Bangladesh somewhat like India, though? I mean, because India has so many different, areas where there's different languages. I mean, Bangladesh obviously is smaller by land area, but still, I mean, is there just one language in Bangladesh, or are there more languages in Bangladesh?
No, Bengali is the national language, is the key language is spoken in Bangladesh. And there are probably fewer internecine wars, battles happening in Bangladesh than are happening in India. So from that perspective, Bangladesh has been more peaceful than India has been.
Yeah, also talking about Myanmar, what is the situation with the Rohingya there? I mean, that's a Muslim minority group that really, I don't even think they have citizenship in Myanmar, but they still happen to live there. I know it's very much a humanitarian crisis there.
Yeah, no one really cares about it. I think really people have given up on the refugees from Myanmar. Yeah. And I think that's because, those refugees don't make a difference to the Western countries. And as long as Western countries don't get influenced, I think we have learned to ignore those human rights violations. But, these countries are ridden with tribal conflicts where raping or killing people from the opposing tribe is of no consequence. Women will encourage raping of other people. And that's been happening in Manipur, in the northeastern part of India as well. Women of one side have been openly encouraging women of the other side to be raped. So this is the mentality of the people of the third world countries. They are amoral people. There's no moral fabric keeping these people together. They are driven by material acquisition, by survival and existential issues. So they have no moral values, and they have no way to empathize or to think of other people. And that's been the case with Myanmar, not just with the refugees, Muslim refugees. It's been the case with so many tribal groups that exist in Myanmar who have crossed over to Bangladesh and India to survive. So this is not just the Muslim minority crisis. It's several many people within Myanmar who have been fighting a war with the government and have been on the side of being a sufferer. But I wouldn't say it's that way, because they are just the other side of the same coin.
What do you think makes these people amoral? I mean, is it something that? I mean, if let's say a baby in Bangladesh was, newborn, was brought to America immediately, would that baby grow up to be an American, or would that baby still be like the people in Bangladesh?
Well, that's a very politically incorrect question, really, because most probably that baby grows up to be a Bangladeshi baby, the nurture is responsible only to an extent in elevating you to becoming a conscious moral person. Nature is extremely important, and nature is something that we have in the West decided to ignore and avoid. In my view, at least at the very least, we should pay attention and not just get rid of people who have a view on IQ and where these people are coming from. They find it extremely difficult to assimilate, and there are a lot of twin studies, Chris, twin studies to do with twins who were separated at birth. One stayed back in the third world country, and the other one was moved to the Western country. And there are very compassionate, charitable Western people in Europe and in North America who adopted those people. But those people, adopted people, did not turn out to be the way you would have expected from a well-educated American child.
Well, yeah, it's certainly something I ask myself too. It's, even as maybe as a first grader, I was asking myself, why is math so easy for me and math isn't so easy for these other people? I noticed that as a first grader. It's, differences in talents. And I think we'd all like to believe that, science can make everybody smarter. I mean, obviously I think that's a noble thing, but whether or not we can do it, that's the whole question. It's.
Chris, I have been to sub-Saharan African countries where I have paid $10 American in cash to buy something. I got $15 cash back. Plus the product I bought. So they can't do very simple mathematical calculation. I have been to hotels, top class hotels in Africa, where checking out takes 10 minutes, something that would have been fully prepaid, but the receptionist simply looks at the screen for 10 minutes trying to process whatever 5 things there are on the screen. So, we really have to accept in the Western world that IQ and biological impulses are different for different people who grew up, whose biology were developed differently, whose genes evolved differently based on the climate or conditions that their ancestors existed in.
Well, also things like food and, just other, I mean, because I think we all came from a common ancestor, maybe 100,000 years ago or something like that. I don't know that much, but it's it's definitely something that's politically incorrect, but it's something that I think does exist. There are definitely people have different aptitudes. I mean, and you've said that's why dictatorships work better for these people, because apparently.
It's not just about dictatorship, Chris. I think democracy doesn't work anywhere anyway. But there is within the Western society, democracy can lead to only so much worsening, because people are relatively awakened in the Western society. But democracy is nothing but mob rule in the third world, where 80 to 90% people are completely tribal. They have no concept of anything except outside tribalism. Now, when these people vote, they vote on the basis of their tribe and religion. And in fact, Chris, you don't even have to go to sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent for it. All you have to do is to look at the ghettos of third world countries, third world people in the Western society, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, or in Canada. The ghettos vote for people of their own race, of their own religion, and of their own kind. So that's exactly what happens in the third world. And as a result, what you actually need anyway, even in the Western society, is to have meritocratic people rise to the top. Now, meritocracy cannot happen under democracy, because democracy is giving the right to decide on who rules to the bottom 51% of the population, or should I say 50% plus 1% population.
Yeah, it does. It's like Stephen Wright said, half the people in this world are dumber than I am.
Well, yeah, and Chris,
if you're average, then half the people, or half the people are below average.
Yes, Chris, and remember, even in countries like Sweden, Norway, or Switzerland, which are relatively very open-minded, very prosperous, very enlightened countries, 80 to 90% people are interested in nothing else than doing their 9 to 5 job, going back home and having a good time, and looking forward to their yearly vacations. So that's the nature of people, and there's nothing wrong about it. All I'm saying is that. Uh, the people who should decide on who should run the country should be the people who actually have consciousness about public policy, who have thought through those things. Other people have no reason to vote, if I may so use that word, in who decides to run the country.
Yeah. Yeah, but it does also, but we've also seen a case too where a lot of times the so-called experts are messing things up as much as the common people do. I mean,
absolutely. And I'm not calling them elite. I'm not calling them people who understand public policy. These are career intellectuals who went from their mom's lap to Ivy League colleges, growing up in urban areas without really an understanding of complexity of life, who think that everything is predictable, where security is taken for granted, electricity and water is taken for granted. These are not the people who necessarily grow up to be sharp enough to have a complex thinking. But they are the people who end up now in elite positions in our bureaucracies. So I completely agree, but they are not the natural elite. I'm talking about natural elite. There has to be a way for natural elite to rise up in power, which was the case in the past. Democracy has upended that meritocracy.
Yeah, it definitely has. I mean, I think that was something where that's been upended a lot. It's it's really something, and you mentioned what's happening in Bangladesh, and you mentioned Myanmar. Is there anything? What's going on in India right now?
Well, India is a complete mess, Chris. There's two sides of the story. One is what the international media portrays. The international media says that India is the fastest growing economy in the world, large economy in the world. India is apparently, according to them, catching up with China, and India is where a move of factories is happening from China to India. I don't see any evidence of that. This is all a myth. Indian economy is actually is stagnant at best, if not falling. There's currently deindustrialization happening. Tens of millions of people have moved from urban areas to rural places. The growth rate is a creation of statisticians. It is not corrected properly. It is not discounted for inflation properly. And there are some fake numbers in that growth rate. But whosoever points that out is kicked out of the discussion space. So from what I have seen, India has continued to worsen, Chris, since the time the British left the country. It is far worse today than it was 5 years back. And it's 10 years back, it was far worse than what it was 20 years back. And I tell you, 10 years later, India will be so much worse that even I will be nostalgic for what India is like today. So there's a huge amount of wretchedness, crisis, poverty, disease, crime, corruption in that country. And you can go to anyone, absolutely anyone in the country, and the only thing that matters is bribes. Bribes are openly asked for. This is like a trade in a fish market. You go to a government office, everything is bribes. You go to the court, everything is bribes. You go higher up, the only thing that changes is the quantum of bribes. And you can go as high as possible and as horizontally or vertically as possible. The only thing that changes is quantum of bribes.
And so you have a situation also where nobody trusts anybody else.
Well, the trust is not a concept in that society. This is something, these are the questions. Whether they have trust or not is a question that someone who grew up in a society where 10 commandments are a given asks those questions. Those questions are not asked in the third world countries. In fact, If you trust someone, I absolutely tell you, Chris, the other person will think you are stupid. So that is the level of
Yes.
the concept of trust in these countries.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. We just had the Olympics and India got a total of 6 medals. And look at countries that got more medals than India did. Ireland got 7. Sakartvelo got 7. Bulgaria got 7. Azerbaijan got 7. Croatia got 7. I mean, these are countries that have a lot less people than India.
Well, Indian population grows by more than the populations of any of these countries every single year. So it's like 100 times population differences between these countries and India.
And China, which has a similar population, or close to it, got 91 medals. So that is not very many Olympic medals for India.
Olympic medals is not something I care much about, but this is certainly a symbol of what the degradation and deprivations that exist in India.
Well, if your country is richer, you have more time to do leisure things. You have more time money to spend on sports and stuff like that. It's
not necessarily, Chris.
Okay.
You have to we were all poor at one point of time. Western society was poor at one point of time. There was a spark of moral values that got kindled triggered in the Western society, and you can trace it as long back as about 3 millennia back. Greek and Roman people started thinking of philosophy and reasoning and moral values. Jerusalem created a concept of moral values. So these things started emerging in their very nascent form about 3 millennia back in the Western society, something that hasn't even got started in the third world countries so far.
What would happen to you, say, if they adopted Christianity? Or some of these countries are Muslim, like Bangladesh and Pakistan.
Nothing would have changed in any material terms, because the only thing that would have changed is that Christianity would have become voodoo, and Christianity has become voodoo in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caribbean islands, in the Indian subcontinent. Just Google Christianity and India, or Google Christianity and sub-Saharan Africa, and you will see sites that will horrify you. So Christianity is a very voodooized religion in these countries, because the problem, Chris, is that you have to have a rational and moral foundations. If you don't have that anything that you build over it will be very weak. It will fall apart very quickly, and it will get perverted actually worse. And that's what Christianity has become. It will get perverted. Not just Christianity, but everything good that you give to these people becomes perverted. You give them prosperity, education, democracy, considering democracy to be a good thing. Anything you give them gets perverted. The Western institutions in the third world have got completely perverted.
Yes, well, it sounds like to me they don't have the ability to maintain the infrastructure they have. So if a bridge collapses, it may not get rebuilt, or if roads may not be maintained, or factories may not be maintained either.
Well, Chris, so there is apparently an office in London run and paid by the government of the United Kingdom that follows and keeps track of the bridges in India. Now, I know it sounds shocking. What are British doing 76 years after they left the country? They keep a record of all the bridges they constructed in India, and which bridge still needs maintenance and which bridge has gone past its life. And they alert the government of India about it. But of course, government of India doesn't care, doesn't do anything. And bridges fall apart on a daily basis in that country. Roads get washed away after a single rain. And during construction of every bridge, even a small 100-meter long bridge, a few people die. So, the cost of building anything is humongous. The corruption involved in infrastructure is humongous. They can't even maintain it, as you rightly said. Forget about trying to construct it. And that's why I consistently advise the government of India, not that they are listening to me, that is stop building all infrastructure, because everything will fall apart and it will leave an environmental legacy.
Yes, it will leave an environmental legacy. Why do you think the West is fat? I mean, I know lots of people who, who have visited India and talk about, how spiritual India is and all this other nonsense. I mean, and I have to admit, I was curious about it before, but now that I've heard from you, it's like, I have absolutely positively no interest in ever going there.
Well, so Chris, it's very easy to understand why you or some people from America might find India very spiritual and very nice. So firstly, as a white guy, you are treated like a god in that country. You are treated very respectfully. You are given special privileges. If something happens to you, in my city, when I was actually in my city in India, I think 3 years back, an Italian backpacker had his camera stolen. The chief minister of the state got involved in tracing the thief. So that's the kind of servile, obsequious mentality even the very top leaders of that country have towards the white guy. So firstly, they are treated very respectfully. Secondly, your dollar goes a very long way. You earn, a daily wage in India is about, let's say, $3. $3 a day for a 12-hour work. In the US, it's about 3 times for an hour of work. So
Yes.
the daily wages in America is about 100 times as that of an Indian wage earner. So now, if this wage earner from America goes to India, he can live in nice, better hotels. He is treated like God. His money goes really very far. He has a good beer drink for. He can have a good meal, decent meal, which might actually make him sick later, but that's not what he thinks right away. But he pays a couple of dollars for all these things. So he's as a white guy, he's treated very nicely. His money goes very long way, and then he doesn't work, so he doesn't know what living in India and working in India really means. What kind of exploitation, abuses, and corruption you have to face. When these people go and live and work in India for a couple of years as a normal guy, then I ask them to tell me that they really understand India or not. Otherwise, forget about it. But lastly, Chris, here is the issue why India is seen as a spiritual country. In the 1960s and 70s, hippies and the Beatles started going to India. They were the people who glorified and romanticized India. And why did they do it? Because they were on weed while they were traveling around in India. Now, Chris, when you are drunk or you are on, I don't take drugs, but when you are on drugs 24 hours a day, everything looks good to you. You could be lying next to a poop-ridden road, but you wouldn't feel anything. So, Indian spirituality is India has no spirituality, Chris. But also, there's another thing that might actually be about India, which is that when you live in a system like a Western system where there are fences, there's a rule of law, there are constraints, there are moral constraints, there are civilizational pressures, which should exist for a society to be a civilization. But when that goes away, you feel cathartic. And that's the feeling, Chris, you would get if after a hard week of work, you go to a pub in the evening, if it's noisy, and you have a few drinks. You will feel cathartic. It's exactly the same thing that might happen to you when you are in India. There's not, there are no constraints. You can do whatever you want. No one cares for you. There's no pressures, and everything is cheap. So you have catharsis, but don't confuse catharsis with spirituality.
Yeah, that's true. I remember another guy who went down to Haiti, and there was this. He always got this attitude. He's American. He knows what he's doing. they expected him to be competent. That is kind of interesting. Yeah, because and I guess that's a lot of different places, but if you said Pax Americana, I mean, not really able to influence these countries. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the president of the United States really has had more power than Genghis Khan or Julius Caesar, right? I mean, really
Yes.
more power than anybody. Maybe for a while British prime ministers had more power, but but even now, as you said, the influence goes away. It just doesn't. Once that goes away, they just kind of do whatever they want, and who's filling that void? Would it be the Chinese or would it be the Russians?
I don't see anyone filling up that void, Chris. I spend a fair bit of my time in East Asia. I go to China often, and I tell you, I don't think Chinese government thinks in terms of controlling the world. They think in terms of what they can get out of the world. That's all. So they think in terms of trading with the world. They want to trade with every possible country, and they don't care about what else happens in those countries. If you marry 20 women, they have no problems in your society. So China is not there to control the world. In fact, I don't even think China is competent to rule the world. They are East Asia is not philosophically grounded society necessarily. They are not in a position to rule the world. They are the best societies as they stand today. I think they are the future of the world, but they are not in a position to rule the world, and they don't like to rule the world either.
What do you think about Taiwan and the situation with China and Taiwan?
Well, Chris, very strongly believe that Hong Kong and Taiwan and Macau should have been independent countries. They should have been given the honor of independence 3 decades back. And all these countries, the powerful United Kingdom, France, United Kingdom, Nancy Pelosi was a reasonably grown-up woman at that time. She should have asked for full independence of Taiwan and Hong Kong those days. But now, when China is so strong, you don't want to agitate China by talking too much about Taiwan and Hong Kong. It's too late now. America is past its peak. China is the growing economy. China is becoming stronger by the day. Today, American armed forces have troubles fighting with Afghanistan or relatively small countries. They are it's going to be a tough job challenging China. So it's not the right time to challenge China. But I openly say, and I love China, but I openly say that Hong Kong and Taiwan should have been independent countries. But at this moment, Americans have should not interfere in what's happening in these countries, because they're agitating China. And the reason, if I were in the top position of China, I would do exactly what Chinese Xi Jinping is doing. And the reason is that if you allow, as the head of the state of China, to let Hong Kong or Taiwan go independent, places within China will start asking for independence. Xinjiang is always ready to ask for independence. Tibet is always ready to ask for independence. And there are a lot of other people that will start thinking of asking for independence if China gives independence to Hong Kong or Taiwan. So let's not agitate China. Let things just evolve naturally from now on.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Taiwan. I didn't realize that there were other regions that might want independence from China. I suppose Tibet as well. That's very interesting. Do you think? But China, was taken over by Mao, and Taiwan was not. So, do you think? I mean, do you notice what differences do you notice between China and Taiwan?
So I have spent time in both the countries, and I really think that coming back to what we were talking about initially. There are people who can be thrown into any kind of ecology and they evolve. They become richer and well established, and there are people who fail. Chinese, you can throw them in any ecology they do very well. They come to America completely broke. They become rich very quickly. They are now occupying a lot of retail shops in sub-Saharan Africa. China is a wonderful place, and a lot of cities, and I'm talking about not just 5, 10, 15 cities in China. There are scores of cities in China which now look like Singapore. Their public transportation system is as good as Singapore, and they have very likely copied a lot of things from Singapore anyway. So I don't think that the kind of governance they have is what really matters. What really matters is the key ingredient, which is the kind of people you have. And that is why I say you can transplant Germans into India, and within a week, India will start looking like Germany. So, Taiwan looks great to me. China looks great to me. In a way, I can't even distinguish between the two countries today. Of course, Taiwan is 20 years ahead of China in terms of economic growth. But if you go to Shanghai, Beijing, or actually Shenzhen, I mean, go to Shenzhen, and it's an amazing place. It's more modern than Hong Kong and very likely richer than Hong Kong today.
Yeah, so Singapore, you think what makes Singapore a model for these places? What is Singapore doing right?
So Chris, I used to live in Singapore at one point of time. I lived there for a couple of years, and I still go to Singapore quite often. Now, Singapore is, in my view, the best run country on the planet. I haven't seen another country which is better run than Singapore. So anyone who is interested in public policy should pay attention to how Singapore is run. And again, I lived there for a couple of years, so I know it from close distance how Singapore works. Everything works in that country, and the taxes are low. Public transportation actually makes money, despite the fact that public transportation is very cheap. You can go from one part of Singapore to another part of Singapore for about $1.50 or something. I didn't even keep track of the money I was spending. So this is what Singapore did. The greatest statesman of the last century was Lee Kuan Yew. As a libertarian, I started reading his books, and I thought, well, this is a dictator and I'll hate him. And Chris, I read his autobiography, and I did not find a single fault in what he did. He is the person who not only... So he was an Anglophile. He believed in the Western institutions. He believed in the Western ways of doing things. And what he did was he retained the Western institution. And Singapore is the only third world country, which used to be a third world country, which actually improved after the colonizers left. And what Lee Kuan Yew did was he kept Australians, Kiwis, Americans, and British in Singapore. He gave them bases, and because he wanted security and he wanted to have Western ways adopted in Singapore. So he maintained the Western institutions that were left behind, and he improved on those. So that is where Singapore comes in. Everyone who has an interest in public policy should pay attention to Singapore.
So, and he was prime minister from 1959 to 1990. So I can imagine that's almost that's a very long tenure as a prime minister. So,
yeah, very brave guy as well. I mean, this was, you look at his history, what he did, and you wonder how a human being was able to consistently outperform and consistently achieve his goals despite hostile powers all around him. I mean, Singapore is a dot on the map. North of that is Malaysia, a hostile power which actually had army bases within Singapore, a hostile people south of Singapore, Indonesia, everyone trying to get rid of Singapore, but he created a situation, and he moved forward in a way that he became the more powerful country in that area. And now the whole of that area depends on Singapore in many ways.
Yeah, it's well, Singapore also doesn't really have any. I mean, it doesn't really. It's just a small country that doesn't really have any resources. But I've heard, they get a lot of expats going in and out. Americans, British, Australians.
It's full of experts. It's full of experts. You walk on the streets and you will you might even think sometimes that you are in a Western country because there are so many expats working in Singapore.
Yeah, but it's also but because of that also you have maybe that brain and also, you know, because they're maybe not living there that long, they probably never bring their cars. You know, I had a cousin who lived in Singapore for a couple of years while her husband was helping instruct a plant for DuPont. So, and she certainly talked about Singapore. You know, I think that one thing she talked about, you know, she said she never felt safer anywhere, you know, just walking down the street, you know.
Sorry, she did not feel safe, or she
felt safer in Singapore than any place else.
If your 16-year-old daughter goes out at 2 o'clock in the night in the worst part of Singapore, you have nothing to fear. That's how safe the country is.
Yeah. She mentioned the country was very safe and also it sounds like to me too, it's a very much a high trust environment where people can work together. And I mean, I think the trust is often a lot of the foundation. You know, it's.
Well, what Chris, very interesting about Singapore, which I now increasingly see in China as well, is that you go to a food court and universally in Singapore, this is the code of conduct. Women leave their purses on the table, walk away to a faraway food court and bring their food back 10 or 15 minutes later. When I first started going to Singapore, I wanted to alert these women, hey, did you forget your purse? But then I realized that when I started living there, I started doing exactly the same thing because nothing goes wrong in that country. And when you need the government's help, because they are focused on very limited issues, they work very well because that's all they do. They focus on defense. They focus on making sure that society is safe and secure, and that's and they go all out to do their job then.
Yeah, I've also heard that Singapore really has an excellent model of what might be called a truly free market healthcare system.
You know, I was not a Singaporean citizen, and there are two tiers of healthcare systems possible in Singapore. Okay. I tell you about, you know, a couple of years back, I was in Singapore. I had some health issue and I went to a doctor. And she told me she wasn't going to accept my insurance. So I said, okay, let's go through this anyway, and I will deal with the insurance or pay it from my own pocket. Now, Chris, unlike what happens in North America, a doctor in Singapore sits with you for as long as you want to talk with that doctor. This is very funny. So after 40 minutes, this doctor kept on asking me if I had more questions before she let me go. So I talked with her for 40 minutes for my back problem, and I went to the receptionist to pay my bill. And believe me or not, when she gave me the invoice, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was for 35 Singaporean dollars, which translates into about 25 American dollars.
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah.
So, and this is only 2 years back, and I was just a tourist. I was traveling for business. I had some back problem, and I wanted myself inspected. So, this is the healthcare you get. The healthcare in government hospitals are very, very cheaply available to the citizens and permanent residents of Singapore, and government does not have to spend much money on it. I don't know the economics of it, how they manage it, but surprisingly, Singapore manages public welfare at a very cheap cost and provides a very high quality of it.
Yeah, we've been around the area. What do you think about Malaysia? I know Andrew Henderson of Nomad Capital seems to like Malaysia a lot, and he seems like a trustworthy source.
I'm in a gray area to do with Malaysia. Firstly, Malaysia has about, if my memory is not correct, about 10% Chinese population. Okay. Chinese in Malaysia spearhead the economic growth and economic structure and the institutional structure of Malaysia. Without Chinese, Malaysia has no spine. Let's put it this way. there's a policy called Bhumiputra policy in Malaysia. Bhumiputra means a policy of natives of Malaysia, which means it's a Malay-centered policy in which Malays get preference in absolutely everything, in education, in jobs, in promotion, etc., etc. Which means that as time goes by, Chinese living in Malaysia continue to leave the country. They go to Australia or Canada or America to study and prefer to stay in those countries because there's not much they can get from Malaysia. They are mistreated in Malaysia. So firstly, the spine of Malaysia is weakening continuously. And the second problem with Malaysia is that this demagoguery of Malaysia, which is a product of democracy, is leading to an increased Islamic fanaticism in Malaysia. Now, for an outsider who is not politically involved, Malaysians can be very polite and very nice. So if you go to Kuala Lumpur or Malacca, you can go to the villages and cities in Malaysia, and they look very peaceful and very nice. The local guy is very nice to you, to me as well. I go there and I'm very happy there. But unfortunately, they are not the spine. You, at the end of the day, need these warrior kind of people, these intellectuals who rise up to fight for what is right as the spine of the country, and also in terms of economic growth. And that is Chinese. And Malaysia is directly or indirectly kicking Chinese out of Malaysia. They keep moving to Singapore as well.
Yeah, well, Wikipedia says 23% of the population is Chinese. So
right.
So
okay.
The Muslim fanaticism. Yeah, I mean, that is something that, you do wonder about. And also, in the vicinity, of course, we also have Thailand.
Well, Thailand actually just kicked out their prime minister last week, but Thailand is one of the more second-tier country, which will forever stay a second-tier country, that is relatively stable. And the relative stability of Thailand comes from the fact that it grew its institutions organically. And that makes it relative to Myanmar or Laos or Vietnam a relatively more stable country. They do have fights over who should rule the country, but they have, from what I see, have never become the kind of genocidal wars that they have become in Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, or Myanmar.
Well, one thing interesting too is it was never a colony. I mean,
that's right. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these other countries were either British colonies or Dutch colonies, and so they must have been doing something interesting.
I think my view is that colonization was a gift to the third world, but colonizers should never have left the third world. Because the institutions that they left behind cannot be run without Europeans running those institutions. So that is the key. If you have to have Western institutions, you must keep European people to run those institutions. It's as simple as that.
What do you think the reason for no colonization though is were they competent enough that they didn't need to be they didn't succumb to colonization, or the English or whoever just didn't bother? I mean,
yeah, I can't remember. Maybe they never won against Thai people. I can't remember the history right now on this, Chris.
Yeah, also, and I guess we ought to work our way over what's you mentioned genocides in Laos and of course Cambodia and Vietnam, and those were all French colonies at one point. Yeah. Well, as I said to you, Chris, that all the good things of Western society left in the hands of natives in the third world get completely perverted. So the guy of Cambodia, I can't remember his name right now, but I mean, if you go to the museum in Pyongyang, Pompeii in Cambodia, you can not stop crying there, because that's kind of tortures he sent 1/4 or 1/5 of its population through. Yes.
The problem is that when these third world people without a moral or rational base pick up all these so-called superficial values from the Western society, they become very raw communist. They don't have the moral base, that they are not compassionate, they are not trying to do good to the poor people. They use all those words for exploitative and sadistic purposes. And that is where the problem is, that all these good things, when imported into the third world, become perverted.
Yeah. One thing I've found interesting too, and obviously, you're very familiar with Japan. I believe you're also familiar with South Korea. One of the interesting things was with some of these countries is South Korea, especially, is their fertility rate is something like 0.9 now. I mean, this is a country that's going through a major baby bust. What is going to happen to when you have that, when you lose that many people just because nobody has kids?
But Chris, I don't have an answer to that, and that's not something very different to what is happening in the Western society today.
Definitely.
The prosperity means that people start having fewer children, and that is also very much the case among native, ethnically European women in the Western society. The only reason the population seems not to be falling as much as it should be falling is because of refugees and immigrants. But all they are doing in the Western society is kicking the can down the road at best. Although I think there are worse consequences in the Western society, because these refugees and immigrants will never assimilate and will never pay your pensions. So if you think that they will contribute towards your pension, you are misguided. So from that perspective, I think Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are doing better than the Western society. But also, this is the age of robotics. The age of robotics means that a lot of lower level work can be taken over by robots. But also another thing that I see now quite often in Japan, I was recently in the town of Kagoshima in Kyushu province of Japan, and you see a lot of Indians there now. This is something very new for Japan. What is happening, Chris, is that they are letting people in on temporary visas. These people will never, ever get permanent residency, forget about getting citizenship. So this is where Singapore, whole of the Middle Eastern society, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Japan, all these countries work, which is that you can go and work there, you can have children there, your grandchildren might get born in those countries, but they will never get the local citizenship. So they could, but through a separate process, but not just because you are born and grown up there. So that's one good thing they are doing, that they are preserving their citizenry, and they're keeping their citizenry homogeneous. So yes, they have a baby crisis, and that's the same crisis that you have in the Western society as well. Look at the fertility rate of native women in Spain and Italy. It's probably worse than it is in South Korea.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I was looking at some of these numbers, and of course we didn't cover Mongolia, but which is a very interesting case.
Yeah, you have been to Mongolia, Chris. I haven't been to Mongolia, so maybe you can say something about it. Eh?
Well, it's the lowest population density in the world. I mean, about the same population as Utah, but it's 7 times the land area, and Utah is not very, very densely very big to begin with. Half the people live in Ulaanbaatar. And when I was there now 5 years ago, I saw construction all over the place. So they were certainly building. Traffic is absolutely horrible. And it's also become a destination for people who get out of North Korea. They get out of North Korea. The Chinese don't treat them very well, so they go to Mongolia. I think I might have seen 10 Korean restaurants there. So that's one thing that made Mongolia interesting. And of course, one of the smallest airports I've been to, 4 gates, only about 3 million people. So it's, I've been to 2 airports that had 4 gates. And if you want to go there, if you're going from Europe, you're either going to go through Moscow or Istanbul. And if you want to go there from the other direction, you got a few more options. I think Seoul, Tokyo, Beijing, maybe Hong Kong, but it's not an easy place to get to. But yeah, it was very interesting.
Yeah. North Koreans are not treated well by Chinese, which is such a shame. I mean, if a North Korean ends up in China and is caught, he's in deep trouble, because he's more likely than not going to be sent back to North Korea, where he will get culled.
Yeah. Apparently, also, from what I've heard, if they deport North Koreans in Mongolia, they send them to South Korea.
Well, which is fine. I mean, South Korea gives them automatic citizenship right away.
Yeah, and that might be what they really want anyway. Maybe that's really what they want. They want.
Unfortunately, China does not allow these people to fly to South Korea. So they just send them back to North Korea. So a lot of these people have to find a way to get to some other country before they can go to South Korea.
Yeah, I don't share your positivity about China, just because it seems like it's such a, well, first of all, it's such a genocidal country. I mean,
I don't see it that way, Chris. I don't see it that way. I mean, there are flaws in China, and there are flaws in every country. So you can't judge them just based on those flaws, because no one is perfect. I don't see it genocidal at all. I think there's a rule of law in China. And more importantly, I have seen China continuing to improve. I have been to smaller places in China, and I just find rule of law in that country.
Well, I hope things do improve. I think that would be great. I'm looking more back at the history. It's, yeah. So, yeah. There probably isn't a whole lot to say about, say, Bhutan or Nepal, is there?
Well, I mean, there's something to be said about those countries. The center of universe in South Asia is India. India is one of the most close-minded countries in the world. They have virtually no open borders with the neighboring countries. So if I have to go to any of the neighboring countries, I better fly, because crossing the road is either not possible or very, very difficult. India has had a relatively decent relationship with Nepal and Bangladesh and Bhutan and Maldives. Now, Maldives, went into the hands of China last year. India just lost Bangladesh recently, and a few years back, because they were always acting a bully big boy in front of Nepal went into the hands of China as well. So India is now left with only one friend, which is Bhutan. And the reason Bhutan is stuck with India is because in the 60s, when Bhutan came into under the influence of India, the long leap forward and the cultural revolution was about to happen in China. China was in deep problem those days, so it was easy for Bhutan to come into the hands of India. But now Bhutan is pretty much stuck, because India basically supplies close to 50% of everything Bhutan needs. So India will not let Bhutan set up infrastructure with China. So let's see where it goes. But at the end of the day, Indian bureaucrats are thinking always about bribes. They are heavy-handed, they are sadistic, and they are not friendly. So eventually, I would not be surprised if at one point of time, Bhutan goes under the influence of China.
Yeah, and those countries are, also very landlocked, so they don't really have. In many cases, they only share a border with 2 countries. It's like, just the same way Mongolia has China or Mongolia has Russia. There's nothing else. That's true. Yeah. Have you ever been to Afghanistan? I mean, because we're going to go to the west here.
Never been to Afghanistan. No.
Yeah, and you've said Pakistan. You often say Pakistan has a lot of the bad qualities of India, but it's just worse.
I didn't say that, Chris.
Okay,
I
okay, I'm
actually
sorry.
no, I didn't say that. I think well, if you look back at the last 76 years, 77 years since the time of so-called independence of these two countries, Pakistan has done economically better than India, mostly, except for the last 1 decade. So Pakistan has done better than India economically, but also this despite the fact that they had a bigger foe next to them, which was India. Um, so just because in the last 1 decade Pakistan has suffered a lot and it has fallen behind India, does not mean that India will not eventually get worse than Pakistan. And my guess is, Chris, that after all is said and done, once the dust has settled, not that I have much hopes from Pakistan. In fact, I have no hopes from Pakistan. I think Pakistan will continue to degrade, but India will degrade faster very soon again, because it just got an uplift for a decade or so. Degradation is there, and India will eventually, when the dust has settled, will be worse than Pakistan is today. India is the worst part of South Asia, actually, apart from Nepal.
Yeah. What about some of the stans, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan?
Are they I mean, they don't, they are resource rich countries. I don't really pay much attention to them. I have, as a part of my mining work, I have looked at projects and companies. We have invested in those countries, but we have never benefited financially from investing in those countries. So that's where we are at. Private property rights are very much at risk in all these istans, and I stay away from them in terms of investing anymore these days. I have never been to any of them either, and would love to at some point of time.
Yeah, I know. Maybe it's maybe I know one of those countries is you have to be part of a tour group to go there, and it's almost as bad as North Korea, from what I hear.
I don't know about it. I thought you could travel in these countries. You could at least enter officially without any problems. I mean, I've been to North Korea and I fully understand. There's a
maybe it's Turkmenistan. I think it's Turkmenistan. Yeah,
it could be Turkmenistan. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a. Yeah, there's one of them. I've heard it's almost as bad as North Korea, and you have if you want to visit North Korea, you have to do it in a tour group. You can't just go freelance there.
You can't do it. Yeah, well, you have to do a tour in North Korea. So I did a 1-week tour in North Korea once, and you can either do it with a group or with an individual, a military guy appointed by the government. So, but you always are escorted, and you cannot leave your hotel by yourself. You can't interact with the local people by yourself. The escorts are always the military, the spy agencies escorts are with you throughout your stay in North Korea.
What motivated you to go there?
I just wanted to understand what was happening there. I mean, as with you, Chris, I like to understand the world. I want to travel the world. I want to understand the world. Not that I want to risk my bones anymore the way I used to in the past. But North Korea was a very interesting experience. It was 7 days of extremely educational experience, how people could be subjugated the way North Koreans have been. Eventually, North Korea will, if you asked me which are the third world countries from which I have hopes, I have very high hopes from North Korea, Cambodia, and Vietnam. These are the only 3 countries, very little populations, but these are the only 3 countries which have a hope. And the reason is that the day they get out of this suffocating control of Kim Il-sung, North Korea will go into the control of South Korea, and it will develop very quickly, because North of North Korea is China, and south of North Korea is South Korea, and they are both very decent places. The Manchuria area of China is a very developed part of China. It's the industrial base, from what I understand, of China. So North Korea can develop very quickly. The people are very, this is the right kind of people who can work together harmoniously. At the end of the day, these 20 million people are in an official war with the most powerful army in the world, the United States. They're still supposedly at war. So, this is a very well organized country, and once it goes into the right hands, it will grow. It will do very well. Cambodia is, again, I think, a very good country from that perspective. The only reason Cambodia is taking time to catch up is that close to a fourth of the population was killed in that 4 or 5 year war in the 70s. So the destruction was humongous. The institutional destruction was humongous in Cambodia. And once they catch up, walking around the city, in cities in Cambodia, give me a good feeling that this place has a hope once they have, once the dead people have been, the intellectual people have re-emerged in the society, because they were simply got rid of in those 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, that was, by percentage, that was one of the worst genocides ever. It was about 25% of the population. It was, it wasn't, as high in raw numbers as, as Stalin's Soviet Union or the Mao's China, but it was just a horrible genocide. There's the country you see hope for. You don't see hope anywhere in Africa. You've mentioned that before.
You could. I don't see any African country improving, if that's what you mean. No. Yeah. But most of Africa will actually worsen with time, because they have completely failed to develop their innate capabilities. A lot of growth that you see in the third world. And what you see, Chris, rule of thumb is that most third world countries grew about 3 to 4 times in economic growth in the first part of this century. So from year 2000 to 2010, about 300 to 400% growth happened in most third world countries. But this happened mostly because these countries were providing resources to China. They failed to develop their innate capabilities. They merely exploited their natural resources. So this is a one-off fruit that they could pluck. Unless you develop innate capacities, innate skills, and industrialization, your growth is not sustainable. You look at industrialization in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and I don't see any. I see mines in Africa, and I've traveled a fair bit in sub-Saharan Africa. But apart from that, there's no industrialization, because you don't have the skills in that continent. And in fact, when you see factories having been built, they actually then decide that it's much easier to import things from Europe or America rather than to produce in their already constructed factories, because getting the local guy to work or local guy to get skilled is virtually impossible. They are not interested in working. The work culture isn't there in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a hedonistic culture where once you get your salary, you try to finish it before the sun comes out next morning. So that's how short-termistic, high-time preference people are of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's a... Yeah.
Well, I don't see, Chris, I don't call this unfortunate. I think we should learn to accept the way people are. You can do nothing about it. You might like their religions or their customs. You might not like those, but don't try to change those, because changing those will have perverse consequences. So let them get on with their own life the way they are living it, and let them change organically by themselves. But that change is not going to come easy. And the only change that I think that really happened was when Christian missionaries and colonizers were trying to make a bottom-up cultural change. But that was a lot of hard work, and they were not really very successful in that. So we should retain the wisdom that colonizers and missionaries gained from running the third world. And initially, Chris, you talked about taking away a third world guy to the first world, and then you asked what would happen to this guy. My
Or
guess
just a
is, Chris,
baby,
that
yeah.
yeah, my guess is that, and this is not something I've studied, and this is such a politically incorrect subject that it's hard to come or a decent explanation on. But my guess is that whenever Christian missionaries removed babies from their parents, it was with the intent, with the thought that they realized that magical thinking was so deeply implanted in those babies by the time those babies would go to the school, that it would be impossible to remove that magical thinking. Now, when I'm using this term magical thinking, Chris, you have to see it to believe it, because you might think, hey, what's the big deal about this magical thinking? So immersed are people of third world in magical thinking and irrationality and amorality that your mind has no way of connecting with them. So the best hope is to not see them as a problem, not see them as a crisis. Let them do what they want to do, and maybe help them get a moral consciousness, but not through NGOs, not through woke people, because these are puerile, weak, unsophisticated people from the West, the woke people who think that we are all the same and everything is good, and everyone wants the best. That's not true.
Yeah, it's very complicated. Is there any place you'd consider living there? I mean, or not?
Well, the only so I told you initially, Chris, that I lived in Singapore for a couple of years. I go to China
mean in
quite
Africa.
often. No, well, no, because I can't. I mean, and everyone can design his own life in any third world country and come out very well out of it. But as a country, these are complete disasters, and they are like, when I think about sub-Saharan Africa or most of the third world, I think of the movie The Lost World, in which all you do is to set up barbed wires, electrified fences to isolate them from the civilized world. They will continue to degrade and fall apart, and you can do nothing about them. So that is where sub-Saharan Africa and most of Africa is going anyway. But the world is in crisis right now. And I really like East Asia. That's why I keep going to, I spend a lot of time in Tokyo, in China, and I like visiting these countries because I want to see what the future holds for them. And the reason is that these are the only hope for stability in the future, these countries.
Yeah, Jayant, you mentioned Pax Americana. Do you think, when America over 4 years ago now, implemented these ridiculous anti-virus policies, do you think if America had not done that other countries would not have followed America's
No, absolutely. Lead? Yeah. I mean, whatever America does, people think that that's morally acceptable. Yeah. So if America has Guantanamo base, Indian policemen think that in killing people in encounters, fake encounters, is perfectly acceptable. So yes, I mean, America is the yardstick of moral values today. It's Chris, I'm saying that given the fact that I consider America to be the best country on the planet. But whatever America does, good or bad, is accepted as the yardstick for what is acceptable in the world. For example, this absolute craziness which is happening with this LGBTQ stuff these days, which is sexualization of kids, for example, or extremely display of genitals in pride parades. These are becoming increasingly accepted by the educated young people of outside America, because America is seen as the yardstick and of what progress means. And unfortunately, lack of progress or degradation is also seen as progress in the third world when they look at America.
Yeah, there's definitely a progress. You know, it's so watching, you know, just watching America commit suicide or just destroy itself in so many different ways. It's just, it's I don't know. I don't know if that's a greater tragedy or if Britain is a greater tragedy, because Britain is so committed suicide too. But
well, I think America is far ahead of any of the other Western countries in terms of committing suicide. So despite the fact
you
that
mean
Chris,
closer to suicide or still better?
It is past that. It is past that situation. The problem, Chris, is that America has the most, as a proportion, the most people from the third world populations. So if you look at the demographics of under 18, more than 50% of Americans under 18 are of non-European background. And this is where a big problem comes, because you know, on average, they cannot become a spine of a civilization. And the reason I'm saying that, Chris, is, again, it's statistically in front of us. Out of 200 countries on the planet, there's no country which is a civilization and is not either a ethnic European majority country or an ethnic East Asian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese majority countries. So unfortunately, third world people cannot create a civilization. They revert back to their pre-colonial tribal ways, and that is where the future of America is. Despite the fact, again, that it's the best country on the planet today, but they have such higher order factors working against them that America will destroy itself in not too far in the future.
Yeah, and you know, you're not really very. I mean, you know, and I think I don't really see much hope for Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, and
the thing is that the spine of the West is the United States. If United States goes, everything in the West falls away naturally. They will all fall away, but they are falling away by themselves anyway. New Zealand and Canada will be third world majority people within 2 decades. So America will be third world majority people in just over a decade. Canada and New Zealand are just a step behind. Australia is probably 2 steps behind. And Europe is only about 3 steps behind. But it's all baked in the cake now, because the number of babies born of ethnic European women in the Western society is now certainly in America, Canada, and New Zealand, but elsewhere, very likely elsewhere in the West as well, fewer than that of babies born of women of non-European ethnic background. So the suicide, the harakiri, the self-destruction is now baked in the cake. I still love living in the Western society, but I know that the higher order factors are such that they will get destroyed. Every single urban area that I can think of in the Western society is now by far has a majority of ethnic non-European people. London, I was just seeing, has only 36% English living in London today. You look at, I recently looked at Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver. It's 60 to 70% people of the third world now dominating these cities. So they have destroyed themselves.
Well, there's so many other, I mean, even without immigrants, I think these societies have destroyed themselves in a lot of ways. The COVID policies, the socialism, the welfare state.
But always remember
the divorce culture, you know.
Yeah, but always remember where those things come from. Who are the people voting for those kind of policies? Who are the people who are virtue signaling the most? I have been to those woke protests. I have watched people, and a lot of those woke protests are headed by Indian women, for example. So I look at their faces and I look at their conduct and I ask myself, how responsible is their voting to do with the change of policies in the Western society? Because these people vote in a way that certain kind of instructions are sent to their elected representatives, who have to cater to certain kind of tribal thinking or irrational ways, or else they would be thrown out of power. So they initiate a process of irrationality and tyranny coming into the Western society. And you see the same thing with private companies as well. When Twitter was run by Parag, the Indian guy, he was throwing people out of Twitter for no good reason. And you could not find a legal, you couldn't think why, you couldn't see any, you couldn't put your finger on what was so bad about him. But you realize that these micro actions that people of third world do, micro actions, unseen micro actions, whose cumulative effect you cannot comprehend properly, are like termite kind of actions which eventually destroy your society. And that is what has been the contribution of third world people in the Western society. And you look at East Asia, that hasn't happened in East Asia because they haven't let third world people move into their societies, or not given them political power to influence their public policies.
Well, political power is certainly a problem. Since it's been a while since I had here, one major change in the world has happened since we talked last, and that, of course, is Javier Milei in Argentina. I mean, you don't seem very optimistic about South America either, but what do you think about Argentina, and what do you think about Milei? Because most people tell me that Argentina is basically a European city in South America anyway. But
well, so Chris, I absolutely I love Argentina. I have always enjoyed my time in Argentina. And it's a great country. It's also a lifestyle country from what I see. The people of Argentina are very decent, very nice people on the street. But at the end of the day, you need a certain kind of values to keep a civilization together. Now, I still consider Argentina to be a civilization in many ways, but you have to have a value-driven people as a spine of a society to create a civilization and maintain it as a civilization. Now, Milei is probably the best head of the state anywhere in the world today. Or at least, thinking very rapidly, I think he's among the very best today. I agree with his policies. I think he's doing the right things, but I'm just questioning why he was elected. Was it because Argentinians were left with no other option, so they just voted for the person who was left over, or because they saw value in his ways of thinking? And my fear is that Argentinians were just not left with any other option. At the end of the day, they want a lifestyle. At the end of the day, they want free stuff. And at the end of the day, once their economic situation has stabilized, I would not be surprised if he's thrown out of power. But so far, so good. He has lasted longer than I thought he would be. So in that way, I have been proven wrong. And, I admire your positivism about Argentina, and I'm looking. I hope he succeeds.
Well, I think you've got to believe in something. I've kind of said to people, well, where else is there hope? And it seems
East
like
Asia.
And it seems like he's at least accomplished or is actually doing a philosophical re-education of the country. And the fact that he's very popular with the under 30 crowd, I think is, it's, they actually lowered the voting age to 16, hoping that that they would vote socialist, and then that tactic completely backfired on them. It's so funny in my opinion. But yeah, I don't know where.
Chris, at the end of the day, everything falls apart. Even Singapore will fall apart at some point of time. Everything will fall apart. So, but we should, and I'm with you in celebrating whatever good that is currently happening in Argentina. I really admire the changes that's happening, and I admire the people who voted for him for the right or wrong reason. Whatever they did a good job. So, but again, I try to look at the foundations and where the nutritions are coming from. And that's where I'm slightly scared, because I like Argentinians at a street level, in the coffee shop sitting situation level. but I'm not sure if they are philosophically oriented enough to continue to provide nutrition for a good high-class leadership. And that's where my fear for the future of Argentina comes from.
Well, I think that's the problem. That's the problem everywhere is, somehow wherever you go, these horrible people get into positions of authority, and
that's democracy. That's democracy, unfortunately.
And how does this happen? I really don't. Yeah, well, it's well, it wasn't democracy when Stalin was leading the Soviet Union, but yeah, democracy certainly doesn't do anything to prevent the bad people. I might say that democracy doesn't fail as badly in the smaller countries, like Norway or Sweden. But when you have a country as large as India,
I would say any kind of system would have worked in Norway and Sweden anyway. It's just the high quality of people who live in those countries.
Yeah.
You can have social, that's why people always have this argument about whether Sweden is a socialist country, Denmark is a socialist country, or a capitalist country. And I think it doesn't really matter, because the quality of people is so high in those countries that the kind of, superficial boilerplate kind of system of governance they have is not so material. They are a high trust society. They have an honor culture. They have they believe in fairness, and it does not matter what kind of system they have. So I think the key is the quality of people, and that's why I initially said, when you asked my question about what happens if a third world person comes to the West, he will destroy the first world.
Yeah. Also recently with the elections, were you ever in Venezuela?
No, I have never been to Venezuela. It's been relatively unsafe and difficult to travel in Venezuela. So I've been to several other countries in South America, but not Venezuela. I mean, such a shame that it was among the richer countries in the world at one point of time. Europeans wanted to move to Venezuela at one point of time. And now a vicious cycle is happening in Venezuela that the best people continue to leave the country. And now it seems that Colombia and or even as far as Chile, when I was in Chile, there were so many Venezuelans. And, they do, crime, prostitution, all kinds, because they have nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, well, a lot of Venezuelans were also helping Milei in Argentina. So he said, yeah, the door's open. I've saw one video of him holding the flag. That's so, yeah, he's all in, for Venezuela. It's, I don't know. I can't remember if I asked you about El Salvador before, but with what Bukele has been doing, that's been kind of interesting. It's.
Yeah, I have read a bit about it, Chris. I have never been to El Salvador. Again, a very high crime, very crime-prone society.
It was.
He has indeed put a lot of criminal-minded people behind bars. He has also been more liberal with his liberal in the positive sense with his monetary policy, in accepting, I think, Bitcoin as a part of the regime. That said, given my travels in people and having met a lot of El Salvadorians in my life, unfortunately, they are the people who continue to cross over from Mexico to the United States. So my thinking is that yes, he might have been a stabilizing force for the moment. But the entropy is working very hard in Latin America. He can be stabilizing it as Colombia got stabilized, and Colombia probably is a better country anyway. But as he might have stabilized El Salvador, but at the end of the day, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, I don't have a lot of good views about it going forward. And I have in fact, the same thinking when it comes to Costa Rica or Panama. A lot of people I know like to think about moving to Panama and Costa Rica, and they really like it until the time they go into the bushes to walk, and then a guy with a machete comes to take over their stuff. So these are very high crime, very crime prone societies.
Yeah, I saw a map recently. What was actually one of the most high crime countries, at least in South America, was actually Ecuador right now.
Yeah,
which I'm not into, but yeah.
Yeah, it's and so many crimes in these countries never even go reported.
Yeah. The minor crimes don't get reported. It's just because nobody bothers, because nobody really cares all that much. It's in some of these countries, you can probably get into a bar fight and you just both walk away from it and nobody says a word. Maybe it's because there's more. That's what kind of bothers me, though. It's even now, like minor traffic accidents in America, in a lot of big cities, you won't get a police officer to come out. Small town, you will, but yeah, I don't know. Do you think there's any country in the West, or modern country, that's on the verge of righting itself or going in the right direction? I mean,
I see nothing actually. I really, I think there's a ultra right movement is starting in the West, but this is more of a blowback movement. I'm in support of it in many ways, but it's a blowback, and it's not necessarily rational in my view. So when I look at some of the, like the guy called Tom Robinson of the United Kingdom, So he's very correct about the problems he sees with the Islamicization of the British society, and I completely agree with him. But then he comes across as very simplistic, very naive in his understanding about the other people. He thinks that it's all driven by religion. He is clueless about what happens when a majority of Malays or Indonesians or Indians start moving into British. Just because the people who create problems for you are Muslims does not mean they are the worst. And he very proudly talks about Sikhism or Hinduism and how good they are. But look at what's happening in Canada. The problem created by Sikhs and Hindus is huge in Canada today. Sikhs are, Sikhs, pro-Khalistani people, the Sikhs.
SIKH, yes.
They blew away a plane, an Air India plane over Ireland, okay? And they constantly create a chaos and ruckus in Canada, including last week, and they had fight with Hindus. Makes no sense. So just because Robinson hasn't encountered those kind of people, he wants to have a very romantic views of those people. That's what I was saying, that this ultra right-wing nationalistic movement is very simplistic, very naive, does not understand the complexities of cultures, and is taking the sides of people who might actually turn out to be worse than what he's fighting against. So again, no, I see absolutely no hope from any Western country. But moreover, Chris, look at the opening scene of the Olympics in Paris. Now, those things happen not because, among my friends, no one liked that. Yeah. I did not watch much of it except for 30 seconds. But not many people liked that. But that's only because I live in my echo chamber. That was presented to the world because the world likes those things. And unfortunately, most of the Western people are just lost. They have they are too politically correct. You get cancelled very quickly. And most Western people participate in it today. So unfortunately, I see no hope from a Western country. They will continue to degrade. But because a weakening West will degrade the third world even faster, the only countries that I see a hope from is countries in East Asia, and maybe countries like Thailand, because it's a relatively homogeneous country. It has a history of stability. And as Nassim Taleb says, that just look at how stable something has been in the past and just extrapolate the same number of years into the future. So, but don't have too much hope from Thailand taking over the intellectual leadership. They are not skilled people. Education is not a big thing. creativity, critical thinking is non-existent in Thailand. So don't, Thailand will be just an island of, it's like a beach going vacation place maybe. But the
Yeah.
future, the intellectual future of the world, whether you like it or not, I see nowhere else except in East Asia.
Yeah, I know. I understand. I guess one thing for me, is East Asia is not really a place where I can go settle, because they don't really like,
Well, which
Japan
is
has
a
always
great
been
thing.
Japan has always been very ethnocentric, and Japan, of course, is the world's oldest monarchy. I mean,
Absolutely, and that is
yeah,
why. And Chris, remember, you would not have had the reason to leave the US if other people were not given an opportunity to walk in and become
yeah.
citizens so easily. You would never even consider that. So I compliment for Japan for doing that, and I like to spend my time in Japan because legally they don't want me there, but
Yeah.
I go there because I enjoy my life there. I think I like the people there, and I like the security and safety in
Yeah.
that country.
Yeah, and they're probably polite to you in the restaurants and the hotels and stuff like that.
No, Chris,
Yeah.
I have never been able to beat an East Asian in politeness.
Yeah.
When you go to a restaurant with Chinese, I find it impossible to pay for my food. In Japan, I always fail to open the door for anyone. They always open it for me, and if I open it, somehow they take it over from me. They are so polished in politeness that my raw politeness simply cannot beat them.
Yeah, and Japan and South Korea have some of the highest life expectancies in the world, and really that's the ultimate measure of a society.
And also the lower class guy is relatively happier in those countries. This is something which
Yeah.
I was shocked about initially, that when I talk with let's say a janitor in a small city in China for something, she is going to smile at me and want to help me out with something. Now, that's not something I expect from a similar level of person in the Western society today. So those people who do those kind of work are happier. And I think one big reason, Chris, is that the people in East Asia are not taught to have the victim card or feel entitled. So they know that they have in front of them is all that they are going to get. So let's not waste your time trying to get welfare. In all these countries, including in China, if you don't work, you go hungry. And that's the way it should be. So they actually, because they are not craving for more, and they don't have this sense of entitlement. And as a result, a sense of having lost something, they are happier, at least superficially. Maybe I have not looked into their hearts properly, but they certainly behave much better.
Yeah, I don't see that in the West anymore. Although the West's problems, it's largely just comes from our intellectual class that has glorified victims and doesn't support any kind of meritocracy.
Well, democracy elevates the worst people to the top, unfortunately. And this is where I come to, Chris. Going to, for example, a DMV office in San Francisco is a horrifying experience. You have to go and line up early in the morning, and you meet these people who do their job, and not like India, where you have to bribe and bribe people around, and all the funny things that happen in India. But at DMV office, compared to what I expect, it's you meet people who are, if not impolite, very bland with you. If you go do the same thing in China, they want you out of their office as soon as possible, so you get your work done in 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and you are out. They want you out of their offices very quickly. So efficiency has gone down because we have elevated incompetent people into positions of power, and that's a result of democracy. Now, as I said earlier, you might think that these are still white people, but I agree with them that they are quite a few of those people would still be white people. But who are the people who are voting for those people, and what are the influences they are getting? For example, today, every American president has to pander to the racial groups. They have to pander to, let's say, Indians. In Canada, they have to regularly visit Hindu temples and Sikh temples to pander to the Sikh lobbies and Hindu lobbies and all kinds of funny tribal lobbies. So eventually they have, because they want votes from these people, they have to accept influences from those people. For example, Chris, just last week or 3 or 4 days back, Trump said that he would enable more legal immigration to the US. Now, I like Trump. I would vote for Trump. But the fact remains that he has to get votes of the Indian lobby. So he has to pander to the Indian lobbies. And hence, at the end of the day, to their irrationality and amorality as well.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great talk. I'd certainly love hearing your insights on what's going on around the world. It will be very interesting. I think we might have a little more turbulence for the next 5 years, but hopefully we can work it out. Do you have anything else to say before we go?
No, that this is all good, Chris. I must advertise one thing. And you spoke at my seminar a couple of months back in Vancouver on Argentina. I thank you for coming to speak at my seminar.
Yes.
This is a philosophy seminar I run in Vancouver every year. The name is Capitalism and Morality, and they can watch the videos of, including your speech, on my website, which I will list very soon.
Yes.
On my website, which is jayantbhandari.com.
And it's usually in late May. Yeah, it's a nice time to go up to Vancouver, though. It's in Vancouver every year, which isn't too hard.
It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful city, a beautiful country. I love being in Vancouver, although, as I said, I don't see a great hope for that city in the future. But for now, it's great.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you for coming back. I always like hearing your insights. And please go to buymeacoffee.com if you want to support the show. Go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Subscribe to my channel, like the video. I'm Chris Baker. We're out.